Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the New Evangelicals podcast. It is so great to be with you today. On this episode of the podcast, I brought on Rohadi. He is an author, he pastors a church, and he has a new book coming out called When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. This was a really amazing conversation. I really loved his perspectives on so many things. So, of course, we talk about church because he's still part of a church. We talked a lot about how to form different kinds of church communities. So, buckle up. Really a fantastic episode. Rohadi, if you're listening to this, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you on. So, make sure everyone you check out his book. I'll put a link in the show notes. Pick it up, pre-order it, whatever you have to do, and get a copy yourself. That being said, this episode of the podcast is brought to you by Mad Priest Coffee, our favorite coffee roastery over in Chattanooga, Tennessee, making amazing coffee that honestly is hilariously satirical when it comes to poking fun at evangelical culture, but also fights for great causes. They're fighting the war on drugs. They're resisting Christian nationalism. They're a beautiful, locally owned and mom and pop shop kind of roastery. If you go to their website, madpriestcoffee.com, and type in TNE20 in the show notes. I always say this, but if you type in TNE20 in the checkout, you'll get 20% off your order. You can find that in the show notes. And of course, we are going to Trip Fuller's Theology Beer Camp God Pod Edition with so many other amazing podcast people and theologians. Brian McLaren. I say this all the time, friends. You listen to the show, you know it's the same spiel, but it's worth saying every single time. We got Brian McLaren, Diana Butler-Bass, Trip Fuller, Kevin Garcia, Dr. Robin Henderson Espinoza, Adam Clark, etc. Amazing folks. And Noah and I are going down on October 13th through 15th to hang out with everyone. So go to our link in our show notes, type in TNE, get $50 off your ticket, and hang out with us in North Carolina. I cannot wait. Last thing I will say is thank you. Sincerely, thank you for either watching or listening to this podcast. I understand that there are so many other podcasts you could be listening to. It means the world that you would let my voice enter into your ears and bring you a guest to hopefully help you explore different ways of being Christian outside of the evangelical tradition that so many of us grew up in. If you want to support the show and the work that we do as an organization, you can donate in the link in our show notes. We do not do Patreons, friends. We do not give bonus episodes because here's the honest reality. In this line of, I guess you can call it work, but in this community, we from the beginning said we don't want to withhold help from people for financial gain, especially because some people just don't have the money to give. So what we do is we take a different approach. We say, community, we all have different abilities. Some of you might be very wealthy. Some of you might not be. Some of you might be able to really share our content on your larger platforms to help us get the word out. Some of you might be able to donate money to help us make this all happen. So what we're saying is, if you can help, we will take it, whether it's a financial donation, whether it's sharing the show, rating and reviewing the podcast, whatever it is, being a part of our community on Instagram and sharing our content there. We really see it as a community working together to do something. So I understand that I'm the host. I understand that I'm the creator of this, but it cannot be about platforming me. That's not what this is about. That's why most of our podcast episodes and most of the work that we do involves platforming other people and trying to bring people who maybe are in the emergency room, if you will, right? Fully bloodied and all wounded from evangelicalism. We're trying to help them heal and introducing them to other people to help them along their journey. So I know it's a little long-winded, but I want to get that out there because donations help make that possible. Without donations, this space isn't possible. Without your financial support, this podcast does not happen. So if you are willing and able, if you can click on the link in our show notes and donate, that'd be so helpful. All donations are tax deductible. We are a legitimate, registered, legal nonprofit. All right, friends, that's all I got on this episode. Here's my interview with Rohadi. I hope you enjoy it. Rohadi, it is great to have you. Thanks for making time. It's truly a treat. I'm looking forward to having this conversation. So thanks for making the time.
That's my pleasure. Thanks for including me in the mix of things.
Yeah, well, I discovered you on Twitter and I was like, oh, this guy's writing a book, When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. It comes out in June 2022, which really, it could be out by the time this airs. And I'm like, I gotta talk to him and see what's going on. So that's pretty much as far as I got. I did a little bit of research. So I'm kind of looking forward to unpacking a little bit about you and why you're writing this book. So why don't we kind of start there? I mean, who is Rohadi? Did you grow up in evangelical spaces? How did that work out? And what brought you to writing a book now called When We Belong?
Yeah. Well, the book will be out when this podcast comes out, because apparently it's a month early, so it's out. American users will get it before Canadians.
Okay.
I guess it comes by boat up here. So that's part of the story. I'm Canadian, but I was born in I wasn't in a church. And sometimes I say, oh, I never grew up in church, and that's totally not true. I actually started going to church as a kid, deep in the suburbs of Calgary. So I've lived in Calgary almost my whole life.
Okay.
And it was an ultra charismatic conservative church. I had no idea.
Right.
Just give me the little picture Bible inserts and we good to go.
Yeah.
I unpacked that later in the book, 40 years later or almost. And the pieces of deconstructing or decolonizing my faith. But it started there, moved quickly into evangelical spaces. So you have to understand, in Canada, we rarely have a unique thought when it comes to our conservative Christianity, and we just peel everything, we just replicate everything out of the US. In fact, we consume everything that the US puts out, maybe nuance it slightly, but for conservative evangelical circles, it's same, but we're far more, not we anymore, but conservative evangelicals are a minority compared to the US. So that was my formation growing up in the church, of small, white, I would call it now, wouldn't call it that then.
Yeah.
Conservative evangelicalism, until I left for university and then started to realize that all the pieces that didn't fit for me as being a multi-ethnic person, I could never find belonging. Something was always weird, and it's usually many things are weird. And initially, I thought it was a problem of mission, that the church was just incompetent at connecting with people who don't look like it, which is true. But what I didn't realize was how deep aspects of racialized segregation and those pieces, the systemic aspects of what it means to belong, are embedded in the formation of the church, of which conservative evangelicalism is among the worst. So that was kind of the space of trying to figure out where I belong. I went to seminary right after university.
Wow.
Because God called me, quote unquote, God called me. I heard the calling, calling,
got the green light
from the Lord himself.
Of course.
The Lord himself, that's what God was back then.
Yeah.
Today, I wouldn't give up my seminary training by any means, but it certainly pressed me into a space where I'm gifted to be a lead pastor in all of the traditional sense, but one missing aspect, and I'm not white. So the only place I could serve would be in an ethnic congregation, or lead rather, as a lead. But I don't fit into any ethnic congregation wholly either. So belonging was just a big question. And I'm also an entrepreneur, so I opted to church plant. And that was a long time ago, 2008, I finished seminary and then went straight into church planting, to use those terms. I think your listeners would know what that's all about. But I never church planted with anyone. I did it by myself, which is stupid, but no one would take me really, even though I went through a number of hoops with some folks. But just the approach that I had, which wasn't to replicate a service on Sunday, do something cool to bring all my, cool friends, if I had cool friends, just to replicate Sunday service and maybe do a Wednesday small group, wasn't my thing. I was interested in trying to connect with people that the church was incompetent at connecting with. So that was a question of mission initially. Oh, we just have crap mission, fix mission. So that was when emergent and missional and all that stuff. Remember all that?
I've been part of a missional church plant before. Definitely.
Yeah. And so that's kind of the because discipleship, let me tell you, in evangelicalism, they call it leadership development.
Yes. Yes.
Ever been a leadership summit? Every year.
Of course.
Every year.
We're bringing a team. Yeah.
Every year. Every year. You know what's the weakest component in evangelical churches? Discipleship.
That's it. My God.
It's trash. Hot trash. Just come to service, maybe bring a friend.
Right.
And you're good.
Right.
So mission doesn't solve it.
Right.
Because there are deeper problems. So I quickly figured that out and then realized that this whole church thing kind of centers around a long, drawn out, slow process of just trying to figure out how to love one another better.
Yeah.
I don't know. I can't say that the church broadly doesn't know how to do that. That's not true, because there are so many good churches that are doing that. But when we look at the context I came out of, when we look at contemporary Christianity and how deeply racially segregated it is, there are problems that I don't think can be addressed by just incrementally shifting the institution. So that's why I've served in small ways, like in church at least, and of course started to write a lot more about a reimagination of the Christian faith. What does it look like going forward to not worry about trying to alter the center, but come up with new ways, either on the fringe or completely outside of the box? Because as demographics shift in our countries, the church must shift as well. And community must look very different in order to match where people are at in their search for belonging, wholeness, and what it means to be fully human. Didn't touch on the book, but that's like context right there.
Well, we have plenty of time to get into the book, which we're definitely going to. It is interesting how you hit so many of the buzzwords that I also grew up kind of inhaling, organic, community, missional, emergent church. I mean, I remember being 18, being like, oh, who's this Rob Bell guy? Who's this Brian McLaren guy?
Oh, man.
And then I'm at the same time, again, not knowing what I'm swimming in, I'm also listening to Paul Washer sermons. And I'm like, yeah, maybe we can reconcile some of this stuff. And I've also been part of missional church plants, and a lot of the language that you have of just like you're trying to find new ways to be missional, for lack of a better term, but it's not really doing it. It's not fixing like the problem that you're trying to diagnose. And I think that's a really apt point, because I remember thinking, like, what's the Rubik's Cube algorithm that I'm missing to solve this problem? Of the wording I use is of going from like spectator and event centered to participant and community centered. And consumer, it seems, consumer, right? I call Sunday morning in a lot of the spaces the sugar rush, right? It's like, give me that shot of sugar so I can survive, but you can't live on sugar. Anyway, so I'm with you in a lot of these different ways that you're talking about. And so where does the book come in then? Like, is the book kind of your reflections on all of this put into a book of like, hey, we can't reform the evangelical structures. We have to rethink them completely. What's going on there?
Yeah, I don't care what the evangelical church does. Okay. It could reform. Like, I'm not calling for its destruction. It could. I can't imagine why folks, especially people of color, would expend limited energy, resource, their life, their body, to put it on the line to try to save it. But I'm not calling for it to burn, like whatever. I'm too busy doing something else on the outside,
right,
to really worry about what the talking voices on the inside have to say. There's so much life on the outside. So the book initially was this attempt, like the first ideas of it centered around how to build multi-ethnic congregations. That was in my wheelhouse. Like, where could I belong?
Right.
But then I realized that's such a small, like, who am I going to sell books to? Who would read that book? The Leadership Network might pick it up. Like, so I expanded it because the question I was asking was about how do we find and build remarkable people who are already on the fringe? and which is, I think, a deeper question around if you have ever experienced that ain't right moments in church, and it doesn't matter if you're racialized, an ethnic minority, there are many intersections. And even if it's your beliefs, women can be in ministry, same gendered marriage is okay. Even if it's those things, has something put you on the outskirts of community where you have been othered? And have you incurred the wrath of being pushed to the margins? If so, and if you've seen, but mostly experienced in your own core and body, heart, and soul, of that ain't right moments, I want to affirm that. I want to name what the problems are within the institution. So we need to name the sources of that ain't right. And then usher in a space to say, listen, wholeness is out there. Liberation is out there. And it takes a reclamation of this brown Jesus gospel story in order to find the pieces that can match your body and where you're going, where liberation is found. So in many ways, it's not, of course, new, although there are some pieces where there are aspects of drawing into specific stories of the land in which you are situated. So a decolonization of Christianity means a decentering of white Eurocentered thinking. And if you're going to do that, you need to replace it with something.
Right.
So in Canada, which would be different than in America, you're going to appeal predominantly to indigenous spirituality or stories and knowledge situated literally on the land that you are on. And then couple that with an exploration of how Jesus, how God and creation are intersecting together. In America, you might appeal to more Black church, Black theology, womanist theology, brown church theology, liberation theology, all these pieces of where we can find Jesus, because it's Jesus as a God on the margins. Jesus was marginalized, was on the margins. The story is not a story of conquest. It's not a story where we can, as if you are white, you can situate yourself in the story with Jesus. I mean, you can if you individualize or turn it into a soul-only exercise.
Right.
But because the whole story is about marginalized people groups constantly and consistently, that we need to appeal to those on the margins today to find where we're going for tomorrow. So that's kind of where the book is going, is I want to affirm people where they're at, yet add language to help them make sense of their Christianity today, when in fact, so many, or perhaps all things, are pushing you out. And I want to call back and say, you don't got to go. There's a way forward. And Jesus is at the center of that.
Yeah, it's really well said. I don't like using the term for my own story of the word marginalized. I don't think it's the right word, but I definitely found the boundaries of evangelicalism in my own spaces and was asked to pretty much stop doing this work or, leave my faith community. And I chose to leave, and, incredibly painful, as I know that my story is not unique in that way. And honestly, my pastor shook my hand. Some people don't even get that, they just get a swift kick out the door. I think it's interesting because I think a lot of people, I'll just say me for an example, someone who ignorantly was complicit in so much of what I'm now seeing now is white Eurocentric thinking, centering of white male theology, and coming to even the little bit of grips that I have just by reading James Cone, or I talked to Dr. Angela Parker, who wrote the book God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? Womanist theology. You listen, you start reading, you're listening to this book, that book, and you go, oh my God, like I never understood till now. And now it's like, well, what the hell do I do? Right? Like I've been so complicit, and I don't want to hijack new terminology that isn't my terminology to have. At the same time, I've been kicked out of my own circles, and so I get that idea. One of my questions I wanted to ask you is, you made an interesting statement. You said there's so much life on the outside. I think you were referring to like outside of evangelicalism. Can you unpack that for me? Like, what does that mean when you say that there's so much life?
Yeah, I think that there's so much to God's story beyond
Mm, mm,
this the center, or at least what we perceive to be the center, the
mm.
loudest voices,
Yeah.
those who are commercially placed
Oh, yeah,
at the
yeah.
top. So here, I'll use a story for folks who are processing, especially white folks, ex-evangelical, deconstruction, whatever hashtag you want to use.
Yeah, sure.
You know what I'm saying? And
Totally.
so there's these white folks who are protesting out of toxic Christianity, no doubt, no doubt, and they're going to leave it all behind. And that's almost an iteration of white supremacy, in that
Hmm.
you can't even imagine the possibilities of a Christianity outside of white hegemony. So outside of out of white thought,
Yeah,
there couldn't possibly be a God and different and new possibilities out there.
yeah.
Yet there are. And there's so much God out there, as when you read the stories of the womanist theologians, Black theologians, and so forth, you start to discover layers of Jesus or of God that strike you. Like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, like, you remember the first time you're reading some of these books and the light goes off. And I think that's because a part of your spirit in your body is being set free.
Mm.
Oh man, give me more of those free moments. And so there is, perhaps it's daunting, a process of now letting go of that old formation, putting it behind, of course, doing the the therapy to get over some of the trauma and the grief, right?
True
It's
that.
grief. It's grief. No doubt.
Absolutely.
You got to
Yeah.
do that.
Yeah.
Yet there are possibilities out there because there's a more beautiful story. And so now it's retelling or drawing near to those storytellers who are offering up a better way. And it's out there. And so I offer possibilities and pathways. I don't offer, answers, but I do offer options for you to walk down. And even for, as you shared, you wouldn't call yourself marginalized. I did stretch it though I don't center white folks, which is, most books in Christian publications center white folks as the
Yeah.
reader. I
Yeah.
centered folks who are like me,
Yeah.
but so it's a little bit altered in the way that white folks will read it, but I still intentionally expanded it to include white folks, of course, because in your work, you were pushed to the margins because of your theological thinking. And that wasn't right. The community did not operate in a reciprocal learning environment or posture.
Mm.
They pushed you out. That's not right. That's not what's supposed to happen in Christian community. And so when I think of gendered minorities or at the LGBTQ community,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of folks who have been pushed who aren't racialized, and y'all have a story to reclaim too. And so there is a togetherness and a unity towards determining where our liberation lies.
Yes. Man, well, so good. When I read The Cross and the Lynching Tree by Dr. James Cone, that book was one of the moments where I said, holy smokes, I have never thought about the crucifixion like this. I've never put it in this way. And it was one of those moments that you mentioned a few minutes ago, where you said, a part of me is freed and I need more of this. Like there's a grander story where my people who look like me don't have to be the center at all. And we could just sit and listen and learn and become students all over again. And that book, along with, Black Theology and Black Power and a few other books, really began that process, I think, for me, where it was like, whoa. In the analogy we use in our like new evangelical spaces, we see like the Christian thought and history as like a big house with tons of rooms. I mean, there's so many rooms. And a lot of people are walking out of that basement of evangelicalism for the first time.
The basement.
I call it the basement. Yeah. In the corner is the Calvinists, like in the dark corner. Right. So they walk out of that room. And as they're walking up the stairs, people are yelling from the basement saying, if you open that door, you're not going to be a Christian anymore. There's only destruction. Right. And these people, they open it and it's like, whoa, there's a house here full of rooms. And I think there's an anxiety in the beginning But the more you do it, the more you think about it, the more of an exploration it becomes, where it's like, whoa, I didn't know that this room was built by so-and-so, and that's still tied very much into historical Christianity in some way, shape, or form, maybe a little bit different than my basement, but it's still tied there. And I can learn so much about that. And that perspective, when I thought about that, shifted how I looked at different ways of seeing theology and also intersecting with other things. It wasn't so much, is this objectively true or not? And can I prove it? It was more, okay, there's something here. It's attached to the house. I have something to learn here. And that's really been helpful, I think, for a lot of people, including myself, of thinking about it that way.
That's the third or fourth chapter of my book, developing that alertness of being struck with a realization that your thoughts or your beliefs aren't the only ones out there.
Yes, exactly.
And for me, it was, and I weave this story, but for me, one of the catalysts, one of many, but one of the catalysts was going to Ethiopia and seeing an ancient form of Christianity that's never been colonized, and realizing through my evangelical lens, there are pieces of what I was seeing in both their worship, but also in their storytelling that struck me immediately as heresy. And then as soon as it struck me as, oh, my goodness, I've never seen the Trinity depicted like so. Good sir. The next piece was, why on earth do I think that? Like, what makes me think that this is wrong? Like, what formation behind me that I cannot even see has produced such a thinking that, oh, this beauty, this is wrong. So I stopped me in my tracks, and I realized that in a decolonized Christianity, it was never colonized to begin with. It's not decolonized. That this Ethiopian Orthodox tradition was lending me a picture of God beyond my imagination. And it totally altered my paradigm. It shifted me. It had to. I couldn't take my gaze away from the ways that my formation was called into question. And I could have left it there and been like, oh, that was a nice trip. Or I could have dug deeper and celebrated the magnitude of beauty that the Ethiopian church offered in those 10 days, but, processing ever since.
Yeah. So what are some things for you? You mentioned that, there's like some newness here. There's some rethinking of things. And I think we both agree that in a lot of ways, like a lot of the foundational blocks of life aren't new, but how they're interpreted and how a culture might face new challenges certainly is, right? And so is there anything that, as you're writing this book, that you drew on from the past, from any stream of Christian thought that kind of influenced how you decide to move forward, as you write a book like this about reclaiming Christianity on the margins?
Yeah, I can share two of them. And I think part of telling a story or offering new language, especially for North American Christians who have been shaped predominantly in white European centered thinking,
right,
is you appeal to the scriptures.
Right.
So you play the game, right? Like, I can play the game.
Right.
And I went to school to play the game. I'm an expert in these things. Right. And so there's a few things that I challenge right off the bat, one of them being scripture itself, or the Bible, and saying how its interpretation or translations are always through a lens of bias.
Right.
And there are some hot trash translations out there that are super popular. And then there are ones that are better, but it's always interpretation. So that should at least call into question the stories. I still believe scripture is infallible, which means it's completely trustworthy, but it's always filtered through community, which is, of course, its detriment, because you can wind up with anti-vaxxers, you can wind up with white supremacists, and you can wind up with all that. And so that is its danger. And that's the contextualization or the beauty of and the curse of scripture. The two postures, though, that I bring out, and again, I lend possibilities, I don't answer them fully.
Sure.
One of them is a reclamation of nonviolent atonement, or Christus Victor, which I think was a posture of the early church, which is to say that we just came out of Easter, that all the blood and the gore, although blood sacrifice might have been part of the story, the vengeance, the appeasement of wrath, the necessity that God is an angry God and requires a suitable sacrifice in order to appease, so forth. That most likely is not a posture of the early church. Rather, the declaration of victory and how Christ defeats all the powers through resurrection is the central motif. So many of us are processing out of the weirdness, the hatred, the belligerency of this story around Easter of belligerent God, and trying to find liberative ways to understand what this all means, because I believe that Christianity still hinges on resurrection. Mm-hmm. That's my take. Yeah. And yet we need that story in order to make sense of our faith. So we aren't just picking and choosing, the pieces that we struggle with that we'll just sort of ignore it. No, let's deal with the foundational elements. The other foundational piece that I think is crucial to the early church, and I use the stories around, one of them I use is Peter in Joppa, and he has this vision as he's just sort of lying down before lunch, and the sheet comes down with all the unclean animals, and God says, eat. And he says, no way, because Peter's a bit dim, right? He's always just messing up. And God has to, or Jesus corrects him. Within that Joppa story is also right after that, when he goes to a Roman centurion's home and the Holy Spirit comes down to the Gentiles for the first time. That's crucial to the story because it is a picture of radical inclusivity.
Yep.
So the two problems with this for the Jewish believers were food and also circumcision, if that was an identifying piece of whether you could be Christian.
Yeah.
And they upturn both. Now, if you want to uphold it, sure, whatever. But right. Do you have to do it? And they sit down, they realize, despite what the scriptures say, that these things are required, we reinterpret them now because they were holding back community and the expansive love and inclusivity that Jesus sought. And that is a rubric for us today. And you can use a couple of examples of contemporary problems: same-gendered marriage, racialized segregation. You can pick more. But when you look at, say, the same-sex marriage problem in evangelicalism or conservative Christianity, there's a posture and there's an approach to how the New Testament church intersected with theological assumptions and religious assumptions and upturn them. We can do the same with ease and adopt the same postures, all for the purpose of embodying practices of radical inclusivity in community. I think that's a critical piece, so that they're not just sending or excluding or the expulsion of Tim. Rather, there is a completely life-altering composition of community that seeks to embody Jesus and what it means to have this reciprocal, rooted in love relationship to figure out what it means despite disagreements. How can we move forward in love with one another on equal playing ground? So those are just two possibilities. I don't give a 5 steps for either of them, but I tell
you're saying
the
your book gives us no answers, no concrete. If you just do this, then you're guaranteed to grow that new mega church.
No answers. No. You know what? I had a deadline to write this book. I had a deadline, and so I was like, how am I going to answer this in the end, right? Yeah. How am I going to answer it? And I end off with, I don't have an answer. I literally, that's the end chapter. It's here's the conclusion. You're all expecting the bow, a nice bow on the present. We're just going to tie it up. And I say, I don't know. I'm only 20 years into this.
Right.
If you know how, I don't know. And I think that's part of the beauty, is that together in community, we're going to try to give ourselves and each other enough grace to figure it out imperfectly as we go.
Yeah, I love the use of the term possibilities. They're worth exploring. I talked to Mako Nagasawa a little while ago. He's a really big believer in healing atonement theory. We had a great discussion about that. And it was really, again, just a different framework, right? Of like God as healer, God as the great physician, healing the world from sin, the disease of sin. And in that also made me rethink again how I see the atonement. Because I was probably similar to you, taught that God's angry and he had to pour out his wrath on Jesus. Thank God for that, so we can not burn forever. And I also really love what you said about the second half of that. I just think it's really good stuff. And I think how we interpret the Bible, and I don't know, man. I mean, I was just always taught that the Bible is foundational in the sense of we can know exactly. I think that ultimately we put unrealistic and unfair expectations on a book that is not claiming to be a lot of the things that a lot of, in my context, white evangelicals make it out to be, and once I kind of got into some more of like the nuance and just started listening to other people who are just, neck deep in this stuff, you're like, wait a second, something deeper is going on here. And it was quite freeing, honestly.
Yes. It's liberative when you determine that the thing that was supposed to be rules and regulations is a woven story. It has so many nuances, but it's in fact designed to liberate. Yes. It's to set you free, not to bind you in this rot thinking or exercise. Like, man, come on.
Yes. And like you said earlier, it's amazing to me how people miss out, even in the narrative of scripture, this idea of the blessing of God being expanded. It's moving outward throughout the story of the scriptures, right? Yes. And the story of circumcision and the story of Peter with the sheet and the clean animals, unclean, is such a telltale sign of like how people in their own day, because I could picture people maybe be like, hey, well, Paul, the scriptures are clear. Like it's very black and white, like circumcision or bust, like there's no way around it, so to speak, right?
I choose bust.
Right. And Paul's like, well, if you think about it like this, and for some reason, we've lost some of that beauty that I think we're kind of called as, for lack of a better term, maybe Jesus people, whatever, to take those ideas and use the wisdom partnering with God to make wise decisions about how we interpret these things for our cultural moment, because there are problems in our culture facing us that Paul never had to deal with, and vice versa, right? So how do we take those and make wise decisions as we take the story and the themes of what we see in scripture, that, like you said, aim for liberation? I mean, sin's oppressive. Paul says that all creation groans, for liberation of sin. But we're not taught to think about these terms in those ways, because then that's Marxism, quote unquote. That is liberalism. You know what I mean?
How did you make that jump?
Right. But it happens. It's mind blowing to me.
It is. It doesn't make any sense. Maybe that's the point.
Exactly. So, okay. So, man, there's so many good things to kind of unpack. You made a point that I think is so important about biblical interpretation. And you mentioned how, like, it's a little, there's risk involved, I'll put it this way. I understand maybe more than ever, even if I don't agree with it, why the Catholic Church has a pope interpreting the Bible for everyone. Okay. Like, I get the idea behind it because it seems like in the circles that we're running in our cultural moment, we're seeing how the Bible can really be used as a tool of liberation or a weapon of oppression. And I think that should give us pause before we make blanket statements about what the Bible is absolutely saying as objective truth or not. Does that make sense?
I don't think you should really ever make that claim. Because your assumption there is, you're the gatekeeper. It comes out of traditions where they believe that they're the gatekeeper to all truth.
Yes.
And so when you make those claims, like, I don't mind if you couch that within an understanding of, okay, here's where our community has derived its understanding.
Yes.
And this is where it's a blessing and a curse, where traditions with deep roots, like going back centuries, could be the Roman Catholic Church, could be mainline, that you have history and stories to build from. So there's value there.
Yeah.
But then there's also problems when the very heart, the DNA of that institution is rooted in some really messed up things like colonization, doctrine of discovery, manifest destiny,
Yep.
all these different aspects. Like, how do you divorce and extricate yourself from those pieces? In many respects, I don't think you can. So the liberating piece of being a new community and doing so and I think it counts in the context of a smaller community, smaller church, to interpret these the scriptures or theology, is that you can find yourself quicker in places where you're matching some of the cultural demands of today. The flip side of that, of course, is you could be that non-denominational church that is like gung-ho for anti-vax,
Right.
and and you wound up in a totally different place, right? So for such a small community as my own, we don't spend too much of our time just trying to engage the whole. Like, how am I supposed to go up against whatever bigger institution or even church? Like, that's not worth my time. And I'm not going to change anybody's mind, right? But what we can do is we can do our best to try to embody a different way of being together. And I think for me, this Jesus story is the best pathway forward unto wholeness. So you use the word sin earlier, which is another piece I try to unpack. Like, we haven't come up with a reclaimed or even reimagined understanding of what sin is in a holistic way.
Right.
And perhaps it's merely all the things we do that detract from living out the fullness of our humanity. Therefore, our path is trying to unlock more of that fullness, which really matches up to God's story, which is unchanging from Genesis to Revelation and beyond, that God is on a path to rescue and redeem all of creation. That's it. There's not like, what else are you fighting for? And then ask yourself, does that match into the unchanging dream that God has? So I'm not sure if that answered your question. I think I tangented off into God's narrative of
well, I think it's a great possibility that you presented here, which I love. Talk to me. You mentioned that you have a community. So are you like, is pastoring the right word? Are you overseeing? Are you part of? How does that work for you?
I mean, the church, the second church I co-planted is called Cypher Church. It still is called that, but we don't look anything like what we did. And the Cypher comes out of hip hop terminology. So our church was very much directed towards those who would never connect into even the coolest, skinniest, geniest contemporary of evangelical churches, right?
Yeah.
And so we were doing hip hop stuff, art stuff, dance, movement. Like, can you imagine church and worship was movement and dance? Like, oh, and it was wild. It was beautiful. Now it's very much, it's online because of the pandemic that we remain in. And it stretches across borders, cities. So we're across Canada.
Okay.
Looks very much like any other church actually right now. It never used to, but now it's every other week. Yeah, you can use pastor. No one calls me that. But that, makes sense in a way that I do my best to shepherd the flock, I guess, in a sense, but I'm not bankrolled to do that. And so there's a sharing and different postures when you don't have the lead pastor to do everything, or even the pastor to do everything, no one on salary to do everything. You have to share and figure out how to do community in different ways in that context, which is very much, I think, connected to how church or how community will look like moving forward, especially in a post-pandemic and a post-Christian world, that we need to be okay with lifting up and affirming small communities, like your book club. Maybe that counts. Your Instagram or online community. And if pandemic taught us anything, is that you can cultivate online community.
Yeah.
And I was like, don't you remember we already talked missional? Missional is like online,
Yeah. Right.
consumer,
Right.
no,
Right. Right.
get out of here. And now I'm like, look at all the disabled folks who are able to come through now because they are able to at least linger when it's online.
I would love some of your insight on this. Actually, I actually struggle with it. I'm gonna lay out. I'm gonna put my cards on the table, and I would like your response.
Okay.
I struggle with the can community be really done well online piece for a couple reasons. I'm just gonna put it out there. First, I think for me, nothing replaces that in-person spirit in the same room kind of vibe of just we're together in this room. Also, I think that in my experience, I've learned that, and I tell my community this, we can easily over romanticize the term community. And online allows us to tap in and tap out whenever we want. Even if we're, if we're uncomfortable, we can just tap out. If we're, if someone if someone just annoyed me, I don't have to engage them. And I feel like sometimes I'm not talking about, of course, abuse or anything like that, but there, for example, if you and I hung out for a week, it's only a matter of time before something's going to annoy someone about something that one of us did, right? And how you work through that conflict is really important to building healthy communities. So what are your thoughts as you kind of, pastor a smaller community? Maybe it's online right now. How do you think these things might intersect? Is it possible to have some of that friction happen online and move past it? Do you think that long term, after the pandemic is hopefully not here anymore, it's just small groups of people who are just pretty much friends and eating together and doing grocery runs together? Is that what it looks like for you? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah. It could be all those things. So, yeah, I'm not an expert in this. Um, because remember, missional, we're formed and shaped,
Yeah,
like
that's
online,
right.
hot trash. No,
Right.
so impersonal. But then you see the beauty of it. Then you actually see the product of relationship blooming. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's two things. One, we don't need the Sunday service every week.
Yep.
But a lot of people still value the connection. Of
Right.
course, we need it.
Right.
We need it. We need connection. So to take a complex thought and make it simple, do I think we can do online well? Yes. Do I think we can do online well through an old framework of how we would picture, doing an online service for a larger church? No. And I don't think that's the context that I'm thinking of, and how many people, especially generational, when we think about younger generations and how they connect now. Like, I grew up in a gen where the dot matrix printer was like hot. Like that was new, but I never grew up with the internet until, like, as readily available on my phone till probably university. I'm thinking. And so that really alters the way people connect. Okay. I think you can embody the pieces of life-giving community despite being divorced from one another. My sense is the mitigating factor is size, in that the big church couldn't do it well. But if you have your homies and there's a dozen of you at most, maybe you can. And in fact, I've seen so many examples where you can embody healthy community, and it's not correlated to online. Like, you don't need to be together in order to know how to deal with conflict in healthy ways, right? Like, if maybe you're just not a nice person, or maybe you don't know how to deal with conflict properly or in healthy ways.
Right.
Being online or being in person is not going to change that. So life-giving, intentional community is possible. Is it always a deeper level if we can touch, feel, and ultimately gather around the table and share a meal? Yeah. Oh, totally. We lost the table for Cypher Church when the pandemic hit, and that was the central piece. People coming together, having brunch or dinners together. That was, that was the key. We don't have that anymore. And so you have to find other ways, but that was so crucial to our community. But now we have discovered new ways, and also we're finding our kin.
Mm,
Like Twitter has enabled and opened, let's use that as one example,
sure.
people to find their kin, their people, not just to find good resources like your own, right? On TikTok or on Instagram, to find resources, which is like hot right now. You can find good stuff online. You're not going to
Right.
find it in person,
Right.
online. And you could even center around a handful of people who will now do community and look after each other online, or like what, not just the internet, but like the phone. Have you heard of the phone? And like the texting
Right.
and the WhatsApping. And
Right.
so all of those pieces, I think, does offer the possibilities of doing community really well. And we
Yeah.
need to embrace that and walk through it. Um, but, and the caveat to that is, I would, all things considered, want to gather around that table too. Maybe we don't need to do it every week like we've been shaped and formed, right? I don't think so. I don't think I've ever done service every week for 20
Hmm.
years.
Hmm.
We need that? No. But can we figure out how to do life better and deeper together? That's way, way harder.
I love that. Starting the new evangelicals on Instagram in December of I guess, what is this, 2020. So yeah, it'll be 2 years in December. Um, I
That's awesome.
Yeah,
Great
yeah.
job. No, that's fantastic. It's only 2 years, man. Not
Yeah,
even.
yeah, yeah. It's been about I guess what, 15 months, something like that, 16 months.
Yeah.
But at first I was like, it's digital, but I'm a very relational person naturally. And so I realized pretty quickly that people who lost their church communities were just like, hey, the fact that you responded to my DM, like, it lets me know that we're connected, right? Or people would say, hey, you might not know this, but like, this is the only reason why I have Instagram, right? And
Mm.
it's like, wow. And those were the moments for me that kind of shifted even my perspective from, we have to only be in person, have to only be in person, that's how
Mhm,
real
mhm.
friendships are formed, or relationships too. Wow, people are so, I don't use the word desperate, but so much has been taken away from them in their day-to-day, that they are clinging to these spaces to try and hang on, right? And trying to know that I'm not alone, in either what happened to me, or my thoughts about certain theological things I was taught. And that was kind of a shift for me as well. And I go back and forth. Like you, I believe that meals are just, they're spiritual. It's one of the first things you do as a human when you're born. You eat.
Yeah.
It's built into us. And I think that's important. But I think that online has really helped people who have maybe been exiled from evangelical church culture to
Yep, yep,
find each
that's
other.
true.
You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely. It's it's like it's connection, it counts, and then there's possibilities of deeper too.
right? Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So, it's interesting because I don't want to sound like that elder millennial, like, well, back in my day, we always met on Sunday
Yeah,
mornings, and that's real community, right?
yeah, yeah,
But also,
yeah.
but also I want to be forward thinking, but I also, what's important to me the most is the relationships. I mean, there's a reason why,
Yeah.
I'm in I'm on Instagram all day in my DMs, audio messaging, texting, because that's what gets me up in the morning, is that I'm talking to
Mm,
people, not that I'm making a video,
mm.
like, that's fine. But the
Yeah.
fact that people are engaging, that we're helping, that we're trying to carve better paths forward, that we're trying to explore the different rooms of the Christian tradition that we never were exposed to, or we were told were heresy or not really Christian. That's like, and doing it together, like, that's so key, especially. And I would like your thoughts on this. I'm realizing more and more for me just how deeply entrenched this Christian nationalist framework is in white
Mm,
evangelical spaces. I'm realizing how it's tied to a lot of the theology I was taught. Not saying that theology maybe is always inherently dangerous, but I'm just noticing there's a correlation there. And I'm also realizing that there's a whole industry. There's a whole industry that is focused on keeping the gates protected. I call them, it's the apologetics industry, but
mm,
that's what they do. And they're well funded, they're well connected. And I feel like for people to find new ways and carve new paths, we have to be connected to each other. and find ways to do it together. Even if we have our differences of certain maybe theological opinions or whatever it is, we have to find better ways of liberation that focus on the community doing it together. That's the only way we're going to be able to either respond to some of this stuff or just carve better paths.
Canada's a little bit different than America in this, yet I get it in that Christian nationalism isn't as overt, and also the religious right is not as pronounced. Our connection pieces are to mainline traditions. So it makes this kind of weird. Like, we still have separate school boards in most of the provinces with Catholic school. So you can go to Catholic if you're Catholic, or public school. So like there's that weird piece that still exists. But we don't have the same engine behind producing the last vestiges, to hold the last vestiges of power. And when you lose power, you start to get worried. And not only will you continue to protect, like there's not going to be an altering to the posture of right-wing conservative evangelicalism or fundamentalism. They're not going to change, right? That posture is in power preservation mode. I think it's cracking. And when you don't deal with the loss of power in healthy ways, if your whole psyche and narrative as a person and as a nation, especially if you're white, is centered around your inherited power and privileges, manifest destiny, doctrine of discovery being the roots of those pieces, and then building a whole faith on top of it, that when you lose those pieces, it's a threat.
Right.
And part of it is you then get abject violence from it.
Right.
So like, where do you go from that? And as you'll be different than me, when things are so deeply entrenched, when religious beliefs are so deeply entrenched, getting away from it, like you're always going to come back. It's like therapy. You're always going to come back to the quote unquote drawing board to deal with another piece of old formation you never even knew you had.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh man, this again, it's so exhausting. But if you spend 20 years being formed into that thing, how long do you think it's going to take to get out?
Exactly.
And you're always going back to the drawing board, but here's the piece. I think there's never going to be a shortage of outrage, and we have to be outraged. We have to be outraged about the total incompetence of white evangelicalism and white fundamentalism surrounding aspects of justice. There's just a total illiteracy around the magnitude of how justice is woven into the very heart of Jesus's message. It is illiteracy, to put it lightly. So there's never going to be an end to who we can call out. There's never going to be an end to theobros trying to, extract money from so-and-so. There's always going to be this never ending funnel of people realizing, they finally worked up perhaps the courage to realize that they're being pulled down, that they are missing their liberation, that freedom is on the other side, away from these pieces of religious formation. The reality is we can't be outraged all the time.
Right.
Can we? And if we have limited energy, if we have limited energy, what does it look like then to cultivate into life-giving things instead? Like, we can outrage ourselves on Instagram for a never-ending slew of idiocy.
Right.
And I don't know if it's harder. It might take a little bit more imagination. Like, okay, as an aside, I write better when I'm angry at something and it just like spews out.
Right.
But it's a little bit harder to pause and linger and with friends in community to figure out what it might mean to pave a path towards life-giving alternatives. So with limited energy, do you want to spend it screaming at Sean so-and-so, John, Phil, my cup, or what? I don't know these guys. And or do you want to spend at least some of that energy dreaming up life-giving alternatives?
Yeah. Honestly, to be just transparent with you and everyone listening to this conversation, I go back and forth. I mean, we kind of do
Yeah.
a little bit of both, and we do a lot of internal stuff, Zoom groups, and try and hold space for those who are trying to figure things out, right? And how do we move forward? But I think being a white conservative evangelical who helped build up so much of this, I almost feel like a burning in my gut to help dismantle it, right? Like, well, if I was
Mm,
complicit,
mm.
am I like am I paying for my penance, so to speak, right? By now going
That's penance. Yeah.
from like one extreme to the other, where it's like I was all in, I was the drummer, I helped do this, I helped church plant, I helped, I had the Facebook statuses, that were just propping all this up. And now it's like, well, no, I have to be part of like of shouting back. And I think the other part of that too is, and again, it's a weird dynamic for me, but we get a lot of messages that say, you or whoever did the video, whatever it is, you're putting into words things that I don't have
Yeah.
words for yet. Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's this other part where it's like we're kind of advocating in a way for people and letting like the circles that we grew up in know that we're not taking this lying down, and that in
Mm,
a way, and
mm.
I'm kind of ranting, I'll finish up here in a minute, but
Yeah. No, it's good.
in a way, because we were on the inside, we know how the sausage is
Mm.
made. So really we're the biggest threat to those systems. Like I know how it works in these spaces.
Yeah.
I know how it's built. I know how the worship
Mm.
works. I know how the volunteer systems work. I know what Ableton is. I know what PCO is. Like, I know all that stuff, right? And so because of that, because of our experiences, I think that that's why we're seeing such a massive push from a lot of individuals about this quote unquote deconstruction movement. It's not a movement, it's an explosion, and how it's dangerous because they
That's good.
see that it's people who were really, a lot of us were the most invested. So we know how
Mm.
it works. So I have this like dueling part of me that's like, we have to carve better paths forward and we have to work towards our liberation. But also I'm shouting back down those steps at those people who are telling other people that if they walk up those steps, they're going into heresy. I'm saying, no, they're not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like, there's
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
part of it
Amen.
too.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Uh,
This is my hunch, and you might be able to confirm it. This is my hunch, and I think it's true, and I think it's been happening for over a decade now. In that right-wing conservative Christian media, all those organizations, I can't ring them all off because I don't know them. I think they're bleeding. They're bleeding people. They're bleeding money. The deconstruction problem with them, the reason why they're raising the warning flags, what colors are warning? Oh, the red flag. I just figured out what that means on Twitter, man. I'm
Yeah.
not the smartest bear on Twitter. They're raising the red flag. It's because their own people are leaving. And so I think that they're bleeding people, which means they're bleeding money. And so when you hit them in the pocketbook and not as many people are buying the conference tickets and buying the books and signing up for the whatevers, right? I think it's making a difference. And so your dismantling is in fact shepherding people unto better. And
Right.
the slow exodus is rolling on out. And yeah, sometimes that takes on outrage. And then sometimes that's actually you are shepherding better outside of the outrage because it's easy. Like don't they own that? Don't they own outrage? It's just they mad about everything.
Right.
Everything you're mad. They're always mad. And I wonder if I'm always mad because they were always mad and kind of shaped me to be mad. And
Right.
so
Exactly.
is there better? Do I have to relearn better as
Right.
in my own Christianity of how to cultivate like life-giving postures rather than screaming at people of how messed up
Yeah.
what's the guy Mark D what's no that's
Mark
too
Driscoll.
obvious. Mark, yeah, M Driscoll, we'll just use that just in case. Nobody will know.
No one will know who we're talking about.
That dude's bleeding like money. Like people are slowly on the like we're winning. We're winning. We're winning because there's life on the other side. And when you start seeing the light and you come out of the basement, you're like, oh my gosh, it was so dark down there.
Right.
And the light is hitting me and it's beautiful.
Yes.
That takes a different posture, I think, when, content creators are building up like, I don't know, is it too trite to say you get more bees with honey. Is that the saying?
Yeah, you get more flies with honey or something like that instead of vinegar.
Something like that. Whatever. But I mean, it's actually more shrewd than that. It's subversive in that you're beating them at the money game ultimately, not that you're raking in the money, but you're taking the people, right, and taking them out of that. And what my book is about is when the people leave, it's like you're left flailing, like, what do I believe? Is there anything left? And I just got to leave it all. Right. I'm saying, no. Here's some possibilities, and deeper is out there. Liberation is out there. Wholeness is out there.
I love that. And just to kind of confirm what you said, I think you're right. Samuel Perry, who wrote the book Taking America Back for God, he's a sociologist. He says that in his studies, the people who really embody and push Christian nationalism, they're really a growing minority, but as they lose power, they become a louder vocal minority, and they still have a lot of powerful ties. And I also read an article the other day that Willow Creek Community Church, which is one of the largest churches in America, it's like down to half its size compared to what it was a couple of years ago. So I think that there definitely are some of those things happening where people are, no pun intended, but they're getting over the smoke show, like they're over the lights, they're over the haze. They were told you belong, welcome home. And then they said, well, maybe being queer isn't sinful, and they were kicked out. It's like, well, I guess I really wasn't home then, But let me ask you this before we get ready to wrap up here. So your book comes out. Well, it's out. Technically, it's out now.
It is out.
Where can people find it? Where can they buy it?
Anywhere,
man. Everywhere.
Yeah.
All right. And where can they find you? I might have lost them.
Are you there?
Yeah, I'm back. I'm back.
Oh, there you are.
My bad. Where can people find you? Are you you're on Twitter, anywhere else?
At Rohadi on Twitter, Rohadi.Nagassar on Instagram. That's kind of where I hang out. There's some Facebook stuff, but I'm mostly on Twitter yammering.
You also have a website, it looks like.
Oh yeah, my website, rohadi.com.
Okay, Rohadi.com.
But that's, same Twitter stuff. Yeah, I'd love to hear from folks, especially like very similar to you. It's like when folks reach out and be like, oh man, you finally put into language the things that I was feeling and making sense of. It's like, that is almost worth more than dollars.
Honestly, I feel that. Oh, my friend, honestly, this was so cool. It was great talking about this stuff, and you give me a lot to think about. It's really thought-provoking. And how do we move forward? How do we fight for liberation together? I love that. The book, for those of you who might have forgotten already because you're driving and you spaced out, we forgive you, but it's called When We Belong: Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. It is out now. You can pick it up wherever books are sold. Check it out. Check out Rohadi's website. There's some podcast episodes there. There's a blog there. I'm looking at a blog title right now. White replacement theory is not fringe. Amen to that.
That was yesterday's post.
We did a whole thing on it yesterday as well in our story.
Yeah, I saw that.
Just had to unpack, like, guys, you have to know what's going on here. So anyway, thanks for making it work. I appreciate you coming on.
It was my pleasure. It was fun. Yeah, let's do it again. Let's wrap it again.
I'm in.